we've got everybody here. Nice. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate that. Hi, Christoph. Thanks for coming back. Thanks for coming back and sticking the camera in our face. Okay, click start now. No. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for our first indoor meetup of the year. First thing I want to do is thank Ritu for organizing this one. As you may or may not know, we have kind of a group of leaders, and we kind of usually take turns each month putting on the events for you. And so Ritu is on this month, and so thanks so much for that. Also, for thanks, I want to thank Damien and the folks here at Nemesis who offer this space for us without taking any money, no matter how hard we try to get some for him and for folks working late here to stay open for us. They do sell beans. If you're interested in buying beans to make stuff at home, you can buy all the so you can buy any of the beans they have here, all different types, bring home and make your own. There is some coffee for free there, and also water available. So again, thanks so much to Damien and Nemesis for having us. It's awesome. So as you see, Christoph's running around with the camera. If you really don't feel comfortable with taking photos, you can let him know. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, just come talk to me if you guys don't want to photos or waiting for something.
Well, we're not.
Fully respect that.
Yeah, for sure. Also, so we do have some name tags going around. These I forgot to buy new name tags, so these ones are a little janky this month. We'll get that sorted, but it's good to know. If you didn't get one yet, you can grab one by the counter over there on the back. So what's next? So for those who don't know, we have a group chat called Discord. You may hear us talk about it. Definitely want to invite anyone who wants to stay in touch to join that server. It's like an online chat server. You can kind of ask a lot of questions. We organize other group events there, kind of informal stuff. You can just kind of talk, make friends, and kind of do that. So you can ask any of the leaders, me, Christoph, or any of the other leaders, or send us a message on Meetup if you want to join on there, or just right now we can just get you on the server. You can talk and all that. For those of you that have been on there, we are trying to do a little pruning on there. So if you haven't been active in a while, we're going to kind of clean out folks that haven't been active, just to help kind of. It's what's the reason behind it, Amanda? I forgot.
It's just really to be respectful that you know who's there and who's active, because it's sensitive things that we talk about.
Good point.
It's really just making sure we've met someone in person, and then if they come into the server and they're not using it anymore, we don't want to have unknowns. Really,
Perfect. So take no harm if you get kicked off.
And you will be individual time. We're going to make very careful. It's also why I did the name tags, because I wanted to solidify it too. So
yeah.
There's plenty of time, and usually come back.
We definitely encourage the Discord group to be a way to connect around people in real life. We don't let people that just randomly join from all over the world. It's not like an online community. We're an in-person community, and so if you want to hang out in person, that's a place to help organize things like that. So if you're not, you're not very active, well, what we do, it's kind of a normal Discord practice. You just remove those users, and if you want to come back, you just come back. So no harm intended. Just to let you know, we're doing that. Also, we have an anonymous feedback form that I wish people would use more. We would love to hear feedback, suggestions, anything positive or negative. It's anonymous if you want it to be. It's available in that Discord chat, and I usually send it out whenever we do the meetups. There's a link to a Google form, so please use that. If we're doing an awesome job, let us know. If we're doing a crap job, let us know as well. So thank you for that. And then I mentioned leaders. So yeah, also we got a few guests here who are going to, who have some things to sell and show. I will just let you find them on the, as you kind of hang out, make sure to say hi to those folks. And we thank them so much for kind of being part of the community and hanging out with us. And finally, I will introduce Vana. So I'm going to read the prepared statement. Vana is a registered nurse in British Columbia. She's practiced as an RN psychotherapist in Ontario as well. She's passionate about transforming trauma into embodied wisdom. She works with a variety of tools to help aid her clients' transformation and believes in a multimodal and holistic approach to wellness. And on top of that, she's a good friend of mine. I'm really glad she's here speaking to all of you. So without further ado, thank you.
Thank you.
Vana.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming here. Some new faces and a lot of old faces. And yeah, I'm super nervous and also excited. Today's talk, the talk is on collaborative competition. And we came across this idea when Ritu approached me to do a talk for VPS. I was thinking about what do I want to talk about, what have I been focusing on over the last little bit. And well, collaboration has been something very new to me in the sense that I've kind of been a lone wolf for a lot of my life, especially my adult life. When I was younger, that wasn't the case. And I think this is like an affliction that a lot of us in North America have, where we have this idea of independence and hyper-independence. And maybe there are some situations that we experience or traumas that we experience that made connection a little bit feel dangerous. Even if it wasn't dangerous, it feels dangerous within our nervous system. And so I come from a very communal background. My culture is communal by nature. And as beautiful as that is, there's also a dark side to communal cultures where we can go in a little too much into codependency. And the way we interact with each other can blur boundaries. And so growing up in that environment, when we go through that, it's very easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that's kind of what I did. So since a lot of the injury happened in relationship, like with everyone else, and in my case in particular, a lot around community, I just didn't trust humans. And I'm still working on that, where that's still my default mode, to go into that defensive posture anytime things get tough, and then it takes some work to get out of it. And the more and more work we do with this, so working with the nervous system, learning to regulate, the better it gets, the easier it gets over time. And so that's kind of what brought me into this. And over the last 20 years, I've been on this healing journey. And in the beginning, it was alone, completely alone. I literally got rid of everyone in my life because there was just a lot of pain around that, once again, around that the community aspect. And so that was really necessary, actually. And for a lot of us, especially if we get hurt in groups, sometimes isolation, at least in the beginning, can be very helpful. If you don't know boundaries, if you don't have those resources to you, we tend to isolate first. We create these boundaries around us, and sometimes these boundaries turn into very big, deep, thick walls. And when we get behind the walls, that also becomes uncomfortable. And then when we face that discomfort, we're sometimes faced with the message to go back into community. And so my journey took me into isolation, kind of forced into that. And then it took me back into community, kind of forced into that as well. And over time, I realized that the depth of healing can only happen in community. We cannot do it on our own. And I don't mean that in that we don't have, it's not that we're deficient. It's we're communal creatures. And we can try and deny that as much as we want. It completely goes against our biology. And so I touched a little bit on the North American concept of illusion, of independence. And we do interdependence in such a good way where everything is behind the scenes that we actually think we can be self-made. We think we can be independent. But really, that's not true, right? We're never able to fully exist in isolation. The electricity gets to us somehow, the plumbing gets to us somehow. There's a bunch of people working behind the scenes that make this life possible. And I think it's very easy to lose sight of it when we're here. And the other piece is when we do a lot of this work on our own, the spiritual piece, whether it's we're going back into spirituality or we're going into the psychedelic realm, if we don't have a solid community around us, one thing that happens very regularly, and I went through this myself, is the spiritual ego or the psychedelic ego. Although these practices are supposed to bring us back to wholeness and kind of really bring us into awareness of our egos, the ego can also take a hold of that and expand itself. So one of the ways we can protect ourselves from that, mind you, I do believe this is a path that almost everyone needs to take, it's from what I've seen in everyone's journey and my own journey, this is how long it's lived, we don't know, but that spiritual ego growth does take up a good chunk of the beginning part of the process. And then when we get reflections back to us, if we're willing to take that reflections in, and if we have good community around us, then we can integrate that part as well. So it's not a bad thing, it's just a thing that happens and we just need to be a little bit mindful of. And so the reason I actually came to this talk was because I was like, oh, why don't we just look at nature? It's pretty benevolent, everything's great there, and we can just mimic nature and maybe, well, we are nature, but be more in alignment with all this benevolence. So while I started doing the research, I was going into the mycorrhizal network and, the fungal community and how about how everything is so interdependent and so cooperative and everything just works perfectly. Well, yeah, when I started doing the research, it turns out it's not so sunshine and rainbows. It's not so cooperative in a benevolent way. There is some, we put the meaning behind it, right? So how we choose to look at something alters what it is. But when you look at it, it's not as benevolent as we think it is. And what I mean by that is we know that there's fungal networks underneath and they help with the communication of plants. The plants, I don't know enough about this. I'm not an expert on this topic, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But we know that there's communication that happens in the forest, in the jungles. And with these plants, there's also exchange of resources. So one of the things that came to mind is taking care of home first and foremost. So that's one thing that even as humans, we really want to take care of what's in our immediate area. And that's kind of what happens in nature. So mother trees, for example, they send carbons to their seedlings first. So whatever is most connected to them, that's what they send it to. And then dying trees donate nutrients to their neighbors or the new seedlings. Now, there's another way of looking at it, is that the new seedlings are actually exploiting the dying trees and taking those nutrients from them. So if we look at it from that standpoint, selfishness exists across the board, right? And this is not a bad thing. As an organism, ideally, first and foremost, our loyalty should be to self, not at the cost of others, but to keep yourself alive. That's just what we do, right? So this is something we see not just in humans, we actually see it in nature as well. And then we also see excess being reallocated. So if one particular plant or one particular area has a lot of resources, there is ways where it gets reallocated, or it could be seen as being taken by the surroundings. So it really depends on where you stand. And then a lot of these plants actually band together for protection. So when certain plants come under attack by aphids, they release this chemical, and not only do they repel their attacker, they actually bring in wasps and they bring in other predatory animals that keep them safe. So if you look at this behavior, this is stuff that we do too. And then unfriendly competition exists in nature too. So we see it as harmony because we don't necessarily as humans like to see reality as it is. We like to see reality as we want it to be. And this is problematic for many reasons, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So when we look under the surface of everything, if you really look at it properly, it's not so harmonious. So different species of plants that are connected to the same fungal network, they'll invest less in sustaining the fungi. And the reason behind that is, why are they going to support something that's taking their resources and giving it to something else? So that's where you see competition in nature. And this makes perfect sense because, like I said, if it's benefiting another plant, they want to keep the resources as much as possible to themselves. And then it's also tempting to think of plants as helping other plants. But we talked about that earlier concept of older trees passing on their nutrients to younger trees. Well, some researchers actually believe what we said earlier is that the younger trees are taking it from the older trees. So once again, it depends on where you're standing. And sorry, one second. And one thing I realized as I was doing this research, the basis of all cooperation, there's a lot of conflict involved in this. And one thing we're getting away from is actually being able to be productive in conflict. So we don't want to get rid of conflict altogether. We want to be able to fight fairly, and we don't want to lose the skill of conflict. And there's different ways to kind of go about that. And we'll talk a bit about that in a little bit. Sorry, I'm a little nervous right now. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry? Oh, yeah, thanks. It'll give me some time to read my slides too. So another piece that I actually found really cool, or I don't know if it's cool or not, but to me it was, generally speaking, fungi are actually at a disadvantage in these systems. And so they're actually being very smart. And what I mean by that is because with plants, they can extract nutrients from the soils without fungi, but the mycorrhizal network is entirely dependent on plants for survival, right? And so kind of to level the playing field, the fungi in this network, they could potentially be restricting the plant's ability to access other resources, making them dependent on the fungi so that so the fungi also win and the plants win too. So in this way, we see that nature isn't as benevolent or, like I was saying earlier, as we try to make it seem. Why I keep bringing that up is because, well, we're a part of nature. We are nature, right? And these are part of our characteristics. None of us are all pure light. None of us are all pure dark. We're a very complex set of characteristics that make us human. So whatever exists out there also exists here. The point is to not deny these parts of ourselves, not to try and act like they don't exist, not to try and show up as if like we're perfect. If we can really truly look at ourselves, if we can look at our darkness, and this is why this community is here, right? We're willing to look at these pieces that on a regular basis society doesn't necessarily look at. The more we can look at it, if I know I'm a greedy person, let's just say I'm a very greedy person, if I know that, and me showing up in that particular way isn't going to serve me or serve the community, I can actually address that trait and show up in a way that will be beneficial to me and you. If I'm not aware that I'm a greedy person, if I'm not aware of my darkness, then that's going to show up in every relationship in different ways. So that's why we actually want to not try to build a utopia. And I find that in many of these healing communities, because of the pain we may have experienced at some point in life, what we actually want to do is build a utopia, build something that doesn't necessarily exist, and it kind of goes against nature altogether. And so what I was trying to say all this time is there's nothing really special in the way we behave. We're not good or bad, we just are. We have certain traits. And the more we can accept these traits, the more we can work with them, and the more we're going to be able to use it to our advantage. We do a lot of damage to even just our understanding of the world and the reality we live in when we attempt to morph reality into what we wish it was rather than seeing it as it is. And so as I was doing all this research, I actually started freaking out because I was like, how am I going to do this talk? What am I going to do with all this information? Because I was hoping I can come here and tell you how, like sing Kumbaya and go home after telling you about nature, but that's not the case. So then I had to do a little bit more digging. And then I went into economics. And this is where I looked into, I kind of learned about this in high school. I had to refresh my mind for this talk. Game theory, allocentrism, and value net model. So I am not an expert on this. I'm going to make that very clear. So if anyone in the audience is, and you know more about this than I do, please feel free to correct me. Please feel free to tell me when I'm not, correct me. I'm going to ask you to wait until I'm like taking a pause, because if you interrupt me in the middle, I'm going to lose my train of thought. And I'll just be nervous, even more nervous than I am right now. So the game theory, it studies interactive decision making, where the outcome of each participant or player depends on the actions of all. And so if you're a player in such a game, when choosing your course of action or strategy, you have to take into account the choices of everyone else too, the potential choices of everyone else. You're not going to know the choices of everyone else unless you communicate and communicate well. So there's 5 different parts to the game theory. One is the player. So the players are comprised of customers, suppliers, competitors, and complementers. And you want to assess each player and determine the potential of a future strategic alliance. That's the purpose of identifying who the players are. External players who aren't part of the industry, you might also want to identify them especially if they bring value to the table. Value is the key point. Added value. That's the other piece of part. So PARTS. So P stands for players, A stands for added value, and that's what each player or role brings to the table, and what it can possibly, what it can offer a possible alliance, and what value does this alliance now create to the customer. So it's all about one coming together, adding more value to one another than you could have done on your own. And then when you come together, you now add more value to your customer had you been on your own, right? And then there's rules. Each industry has its own set of rules and regulations, and some of them hinder growth. So not every rule is meant to be followed, and we have to know which those rules are, though, and which players in the industry can remove some of these obstacles or barriers through partnerships and collaboration. And then within the rules come tactics, where different companies come with different tactics. So businesses use tactics to influence the way other players in the game operate and perceive them in an attempt to modify their behavior to their benefit. So it's manipulation, but we tend to view manipulation as all wrong. Once again, we want to stay away from black and white thinking where something is all wrong or all right, good or bad, right? So these are really old, because I used a very old book. It was written in 1997. And so some of the examples used are old, so they're not relevant to today. Like I said, this is not my area of expertise, so I can't go into more modern examples. I do apologize, but if anyone has any, please feel free to interrupt me at this point. So like I said, different businesses use different tactics. So for example, you're gonna get a nice laugh out of this. Netscape tried to compete against Microsoft as a new browser in the past. It created a price war and Netscape lost. So the alternative to that could have been Netscape actually communicating with Microsoft, right? And if they had revealed their tactics is to actually occupy a very small niche of the segment of the browser market at that time, then there's a possibility that both of them could have come out. But because they were playing the game without communicating with each other, they became these competitive forces, and then one actually completely lost out. Meanwhile, had there been some level of communication, there's a possibility that the outcome would have been a little different. And then, so that kind of, And then finally, the last one is scope. These games are always evolving, so clear boundaries are necessary. Business managers, you want to be prepared for the possibility that the rules are going to be changing. The rules are going to be ever evolving. So you also want to know what your scope is as it's evolving. And then finally, coming into the concept of allocentrism, this is going back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier. In the North American culture, we're far more independent, and in many other cultures, there's far more communal in nature. So allocentrism is a personality trait that characterizes behavioral patterns and preferences that are shared amongst a collectivist culture. And usually they're defined as more interdependent than independent. And allocentric individuals tend to take on the benefit of the whole rather than just themselves. Now, once again, there's a shadow side to this where you become a martyr and you completely give up everything that you want for the good of the group. We don't want that either. We want to find a happy balance between the two. And, And then finally, coming to the value net model, which is also, I got it from the book Co-opetition. It argues that cooperation and competition between organizations, it's not only desirable, but it's necessary. So one of the main reasons I started this talk was the idea of, originally I said collaboration over competition. So in that statement, I was actually throwing competition out of the window as if it had no value and giving collaboration full attention. But really, in order for progress to happen, you want both. You want to be able to collaborate well, and then you also want to be able to compete so that you both are kind of forced to do better. If not, we get complacent and we don't really go anywhere. So we want both, but it's how do we bring them both together? So the value net model, it's an analytical strategy and tool that describes the behavior of multiple business or competitors in a given industry and their strategic alliance with each other. The creators of the value net model suggested that business achieve more by working with others than what they can achieve by working on their own. And it's based on the game theory and its 5 constituent parts that we went over earlier, which is players, added value, rules, tactics, and scope. And then in this book, Co-opetition, it uses game theory to argue that businesses, rather than operating in a pure environment of competition, should also cooperate, because the two combined processes will create a bigger pie that then can be divided up to produce a win-win outcome for both sides, not just both sides, and the customers as well. And the value net is a tool that can help transform the way we think about our competitors, suppliers, complementers, and customers, and help us stay connected to the realization that everything mimics nature to a certain degree, because everything is nature. And we don't play by different rules simply because we believe that we're somehow separate. And the parts strategy identifies and examines the relevance of each piece of the framework, and thinking about your business as part of a valuable web of players rather than in the traditional me versus you sense, which it's very normal for us to get into that state of like, we're in competition and I need to do better than you and I need to like allocate all these or like hoard all these resources. The problem is we may be losing out if we think that way. And if you think of like every move that we make in this corner, it's going to affect everyone on the web, whether we want to admit to that or not. So the more we can keep that in mind, the more we can actually build something, especially with the psychedelic revolution that's happening right now. There's a lot to go around. Like there's a lot of work to be done that I don't even really understand the point of like competition where we put anything down, right? Instead, if we can all come together and really discuss, well, what are the needs of the society right now? What are the needs of our immediate community right now? And who has the resources? Where are they allocated? And how can we divide them? Not evenly. I'm not saying that we should all have the same amount of resources, but how can we help one another and keep each other kind of going towards the same goal? So how do we move forward with a win-win? I think before we do this, should we do the activity right now? Yeah. So before I kind of go on, there's an activity that we wanted to do, and I am collaborating with my friend Anna right now. Well done, I love it. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Who would like to play a game? I want to hear it. Yes, please. Yes. Okay, good. So, we'll start here.
Thank you all. Thank you all for participating in that, thought experiment, but actual experiment. Generally speaking, in normal circumstances, it would not have been like what we got was most partners stayed silent, right? So if we look at this, if you're both silent, that's the least amount of damage that gets done for you. You both get 2 years, right? So in partners where one confessed and one stayed silent, the silent person ends up with 10 years. And then the same with the other way around, right? So what usually happens is if you don't know the people, or if you don't already have a relationship with them. So say if we have a situation where you may never see this person again, right? And you're doing business with them. If you're never going to see them again, there's a higher likelihood of either one of you screwing the other one over, because there's no consequences at the end of it. You're never going to see this person again if you don't have, and I hate to say this because it's a moral statement, but if you don't have particular morals or values in place already and they're not strong within you, you're going to behave in a particular way that's going to give you maximal return. It's kind of normal. It's expected, right? But if we are in a situation where we're constantly going to come into contact with people and we're going to do repeat business with someone, there's really, you're going to lose out if you start screwing people over, because one, you're going to have the reputation of someone that screwed someone over. Two, the person that you screwed over is never going to want to do business with you again. So you actually end up, even though in the short term you end up with pretty good gains, maybe, in the long term you're going to lose out. So that's kind of what this game was supposed to mimic. Except most of you are all stand-up citizens. Some of you I would not go into business with, but it's a joke. But yeah, so it's something to kind of keep in mind, and that's why strong relationships are necessary. We can't rely on, simply because that's just not our nature, right? Our nature is not these, like, we don't even want to be that way. We don't want to be, we're multi-dimensional beings, so that comes with its dark side and its light side. We want to accept all of that within us, because if we, like I said earlier, I keep driving the same point home, is because if we try to be something we're not working with reality. If we're not working with reality, then we're not going to get outcomes that are predictable. If we can just accept what we are, accept who we are, and work within those constraints, then we have a higher likelihood of success, both individually and collectively. And the more we build relationships, the more we deepen our connections, deepen our communities, the less likely we're going to be at screwing each other over. Because if I hurt you, or if I hurt my community, that is directly going to come back and hurt me in some way, shape, or form. So this is where we can really look at collaborative competition within the community. And it's not one or the other. And it's not about building a utopia. It's working with reality. And so we need to learn from our extended family, also known as nature, and see how they communicate with each other, especially when we're, using mushrooms for growth. It's always a good idea to see how it actually performs in nature. We need to get better at, and this one is really hard because I am not good at it, and a lot of people aren't. We need to get better at letting go of blame, being right, and focus on what works and what can get most of our needs met. We're not going to get all of our needs met all the time, and that's just something that we're going to have to accept. That's part of reality. And then we need to look at, this is another point I touched on earlier, is the benefit of conflict. We actually want conflict. Relationships that don't have conflict are not necessarily healthier than relationships that do. It's how we handle the conflict and how we handle the rupture and then the repair that all makes. We're laughing because, yeah, we've had a wonderful experience around that. And how we engage in conflict is really important. Conflict allows for us to identify what works, what doesn't work, what our boundaries are, what we like, what we don't like, and how we can actually help each other feel seen and heard. Because usually conflict occurs when we don't feel seen and heard, when we don't feel safe. So if we can engage in conflict and then resolve the conflict, most likely both sides are going to be better for it. And then through engaging in conflict productively, we can grow stronger individually and collectively, and we can find alignment. Collaborating and competing amongst different organizations, amongst different types of providers, whether it's underground or above ground. For example, one of the things that we're trying to build is, even with underground providers, well, as an underground provider, if you feel comfortable and the above ground practitioner, so say you're an underground provider and you want to work with this particular client, maybe involve their therapist, involve their physician, if you feel safe enough to do so, and if the therapists are willing to work in collaboration. I've worked with a few different people over the last little bit, and I was able to do that. I was able to bring in the underground providers, bring in the therapist, bring in the physician, and obviously there's certain people that won't want to be a part of that, and that's okay. But the people that were able to be a part of that, we were able to do case conferences, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And then even amongst the different psychedelics, sometimes we can get kind of like a Puritan type of thinking. I was definitely one of those. If it didn't come from a plant, it's not good, right? And so that's kind of how I was when I first came into this community, and that usually tends to be the case. I noticed this with a lot of newbies that come in. There's this very rigid way of viewing things, and I understand where that comes from. However, each of these medicines is a tool, and we can learn to use them either on their own or collectively. But in order to do it that way, we do need to be mindful of how each medicine works, and we have to have quite a bit of experience with it before we can start figuring out how to stack them, right? And then another really good thing that comes out of this kind of collaboration, when we all know each other, when we know who the providers are, when we know who the guides are, and we set a particular standard for the way we practice, we outcompete the ones that are not necessarily healthy or the ones that are not necessarily safe. And we also have the ability to pull them in to the circle. So this is something that I came across 2 years ago or a few years ago. It's the idea of calling in instead of calling out. So if a practitioner is practicing in a way that is actually unsafe or unhealthy, instead of calling the person out, because when we call them out, we create shame, and then we have the potential to dive them even deeper underground. So then they're now completely rogue. They're not attached to any community. They have no one to answer to. So they actually become even more dangerous. Instead, if we build a very solid community with certain standards, and when we see someone practicing in a way that can be problematic to the individual or the community, we can bring them into the community and figure out what's going on. What are the resources this particular person needs? What can we do to help them come to a more higher standard of practice, right? And, oh, sorry, I keep getting this pop-up. And then, yeah, and so one of the ways we do this is by becoming aware of ourselves first and foremost. So doing the work on ourselves. Any guide, any facilitator, if they're not doing their work, one, it can be very evident when you're sitting across from them. And if they're not doing the work, they cannot guide you. So if you're not doing the work on yourself, you cannot guide other people, right? It's like when I did breathwave training, the one request from our teacher, there was a few, but one major one was, if you are not practicing conscious connected breathing daily or at least consistently, do not teach it. I haven't been practicing consistently, so I do not teach it, right? And so just knowing where your limits are, knowing where your boundaries are, knowing what you know, what you don't know. And when you have this collective community, when you are outside of your scope, you can easily reach out for help, or you can refer them to someone else. That's basically it for my talk. I was wondering if anyone had anything. So if there's anything that I said that could be corrected, just for the benefit of the group, please correct me like now, like openly. And if not, if you have any questions, if I can answer them, I will. If I can't, I'll say I don't know. Or any comments, or even just, yeah, a dialogue. I open the floor. Thank you. Answer to that in the sense that, is that the definitive answer? If you're asking for my opinion, I can give you my opinion. My opinion is very in alignment with, I don't know if any of you watched Friends growing up, but Phoebe's, there's no true altruistic deed, where like almost everything we do comes from a place of selfishness. I truly believe that. However, my question, I guess, back to the community is there anything wrong with that? Like, is that bad? Because even if I'm altruistic towards my family or my partner, it makes my life easier, it makes my life better, and it makes me more connected to this person. So in the long run, it actually serves me quite deeply if I choose to show up altruistically, right? So my question is, and this is where I try to really not get into too many good or bad, but is that, like, do we think that's wrong? That, because at the end of the day, to me, how I look at it is, what is the outcome? It's not good or bad, right or wrong. Because if we go into that, it really just depends on which side of the line we're standing on, right? Something that's good for me could be really bad for you, depending on where we're standing and what part of our life we're in. But is this going to get the best net outcome for all of us? If we look at it more from that stance, instead of taking more of a moralistic stance to things, I just think life gets a lot easier. So I don't know if that answers your question. So I guess what I would respond that with is, what is your intention behind that? Why are you doing that? Because there's a lot of people in this community, in any community, even, I mean, I went into psychology originally to heal myself first. I needed to figure this stuff out, right? And I didn't know how to. So that's why I went into psychology. There's a lot of people in the healing industry that are outsourcing their own healing. So in the sense that they're showing up with the name of healer or guide or this, or like there's this label, but really it's this needs to be addressed first. And so instead of addressing this, they're going out telling everyone else, I can heal you, right? So that is where that type of, it becomes a little dangerous if we don't know what our intent behind doing that is. And how aware are we of the fact that, oh, hey, I still have this thing that I'm going to have to look at because I'm projecting onto my clients, right? And that happens a lot too. I don't know if that's answered. Like, it's kind of going on a different tangent. Yeah, yeah. And we all have and I have that in me too. I'm not saying I don't have that part of me. It's just if I have a solid community around me, they can reflect that to me. Then when I'm like projecting or I'm trying to like heal someone, they can easily be like, Vana, are you sure this is not your own thing? You know, and that's where that communal element. So this is not to like badmouth people like that because I also have that in me. It's more just how do we look out for these things and then support one another through this. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think yeah, the way we view these words and the way we define them and how we've been exposed to them make a big difference, right? We tend to think, like you said, we tend to think selfish is bad, but truly, what is selfish? Like, if you are truly selfish, you're not going to harm yourself, right? Like, if you make decisions that are harmful for you, so if you're like, I mean, smoking, for example, we know, I mean, I smoke weed, so I'm not judging anybody. However, we know that it's, however, it's not really healthy for my lungs, right? So when I'm smoking copious amounts of weed, occasionally, I'm not really being selfish there because I'm actually harming myself. I believe true selfishness, if, at least the way I chose to define it for myself, true selfishness benefits me. And by benefits me, it's that my highest good, my healthiest thing. So if I am doing what's healthiest for me, my highest good, I'm taking care of my body, I'm taking care of my mind, I'm taking care of my energy. And that will automatically, even if I don't intend to, it's gonna benefit everyone around me, right? I'm a much easier person to be around. I'm healthier. I have more energy to give. I can actually show up and serve. So that's how I view selfishness. And the other version or the unhealthy version of it, I call it self-obsession or self-absorption, which, I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's a time and place for it, but generally speaking, that can probably lead to negative outcomes. Curious in terms of time. Do we still have time to keep this discussion going? Okay, so Ritu has spoken. 2 or 3 more questions. It's an, thank you. I mean, by the nature of the term itself, I and please, anyone that wants to disagree, feel free. I don't think conflict ever gets, like, I think it's meant to feel bad, you know, or feel a certain way. And then it's how do we deal with that, the nervous system that's dysregulated? And how do we learn to regulate that nervous system so that we can, it's never going to feel like, oh, yay, I'm in conflict. This is, I mean, maybe there are people like that. You know what? Let me take that back. There probably are. Yeah. And there are probably people that get that rush out of it too. I personally hate conflict and I'm pretty bad at it. But at the same time, it's really not about, but I've learned and I'm learning, especially, as I'm like learning through this relationship, is that how beautiful, like it's, avoiding it leads to destruction, period. We know that avoiding conflict is the road to hell. So the only other option, especially depending on what kind of outcome we want, is how do we get better at conflict? And I think that comes down to, sorry, did you want to add to that? Yeah. No, Anna.
What do you mean?
We can come and solve it up here if you want. We can show them what conflict looks like. Okay, just to respect what Ritu, I'm gonna blame it on Ritu. So I guess we can continue this discussion, but what is it now? Oh, okay. Wow, thanks for making me look like an ass.
There's 2 hands up. You get to choose.
Oh goodness.
Why don't you both ask the question and you get to choose?
We got one question.
Yes, sir.
Is there an actual? Okay, who has a question? Is there a question or is it a comment? Not everyone's got comments. This is the not
That's
the
okay.
least.
We can just
no,
leave.
it's fine.
Okay.
I'm just saying it's for the. Oh, is that a question?
Anybody else have a question?
No questions.
No other questions?
No questions.
Okay. Question. Could you Yeah, that was the question. Could you share your first experience that gave you the epiphany? Like you said, you're heavy into naturals, all the plants only.
Yeah.
And then could you share like a short story about the first time you got turned on to, break from that, having the epiphany? Could you share a story about the experience of like the first time you did a chemical?
Oh.
And you're like, holy cow, this all changed everything.
Well, it would have been with one of you guys, if you remember.
You can share.
Oh, that's
you can
true.
share what changed your mind. You don't have to explain a drug experience. We don't want to do that.
What changed my mind is I can be, one thing I know about myself is I'm very convicted in my beliefs, in the sense that sometimes I take it too far, right? So I'm always open to being wrong. And with the plant, when I notice that I'm being very rigid with something, I really start observing it a bit more. So with the plant medicine, I was like very rigid. I was like, no to all the chemical stuff. It's not pure. And the more and more rigidity I noticed, the more I sat with it. Cause I was like, where the hell is this coming from? Where's this belief coming from? So the more I sat with it, and then finally I did have experiences with other medicines. And at first I had no respect for them because I was like, you're just party things, right? But then I just started seeing the utility of it. I had a very bad disillusionment with around psychedelics. I definitely left some communities, and then I almost left psychedelics behind. And then when I worked through that hatred, when I worked through that anger, then I started seeing the utility of all the tools. And then I was able to, when I saw the utility of the tools, they actually became more sacred to me. And so it was just shifting the perspective from these being chemicals that were inert and useless to realizing that no, this is a tool. And now when I look at psychedelics, I just see them as tools. They're not the be all and end all, even though I am all for psychedelics. They're not the be all and end all. They're just one of the many tools that we add to our toolkit. And in those tools are each one serves a different purpose. And when you learn to work with each one on an individual level, I feel like you just get more appreciation for them. And when we use them irresponsibly, they create unhealthy outcomes. When we use them in a way that's responsible, they create beneficial outcomes for the most part.
Vana, thank you so much.
Yay! Thank you. Oh, and I do want to say one last thing to Dr. Yen. I want to say thank you for asking me the tough questions. Because at first it was very fluffy and out there, and I was trying to be all happy and then she started asking these questions. I'm like, leave me alone. Stop it. But that was another part of where resistance can actually be beneficial. And when you're kind of tested, it's actually a good thing in the long run because you really get to kind of dive into the ideas. And same with Peter. Thank you for that message. It made me at first I was like, shut up, Peter. And then I was like, okay, you know what? Let me look into this a bit more. So yes, thank you for all of that. And thanks for everyone that supported me. Thank you, Don.